Hey, you guys, welcome back. I'm doing some alternative approaches with ArtRage. If you've been paying attention the last couple issues of ImagineFX, I've done a couple things showing, maybe more traditional approaches with ArtRage because you know what? That's what it's freaking fantastic at. It's the best natural media simulator for painting in digital oil paints that I've ever used. And that's saying a lot because there's a lot of cool software out there. There's Painter and Rebel, and Photoshop has its thing, and there's a lot of cool stuff. But for me, ArtRage is the one, and it's still the king. And I've kind of talked a little bit about why. I've kind of talked a little bit about how I use it. But this time around, with this issue of ImagineFX, I wanted to show you guys a little bit more, just like some different approaches. Some maybe things you wouldn't be thinking of. Sometimes I like to use ArtRage like I would if I was working in heavy paint. And by that I mean I might use this tool that's like, here I'm just creating selections, right, with the selection tool. And to get to the selection tool, you have the settings here. Open that up. I'm going to pick the polygonal or freehand select tool, and then you can just get busy. And once you get a selection closed, meaning you start a shape and then close it up by clicking back at the the beginning, then I'm going to use the oil brush tool. And here you can go in here and you can select a color, or you can come down here and pick your own color, and then we can just paint it in. And what I like to do with this is I like to use an oil brush that has kind of similar settings to this. It means it's going to be pretty scratchy, kind of messy. It's going to be something that has a lot of tooth to it. It's kind of like a dry brush technique, and through that you're going to get a lot of different texture in the marks. And I like that kind of rough, bumpy texture juxtaposed with the, let me hit Control D here, with the kind of hard edge of the selection tool. So what we've got so far looks kind of cheesy, but that's how it goes in the beginning. What we're going to do now is kind of the fun part. I'm going to come in right here. And, I think one of the most interesting things about art is just what our brains are doing all the time. Most of the time when I'm working with students, I'm trying to get them to stop thinking so much about what they think they're doing. And instead, I'm trying to get them to tune their brain into one specific thing. And that thing is, I just want them to record shape and value, shape of value, light value, dark value. I just want them to record the shapes that they see of the values that they see. And in this way, all we are we're just studying light, and this is one of those things that's very like from the spirit of like a really academic approach to learning to make art. It's not at all a draw out of your head. It's not at all a process that's like super experimental. It's really kind of like a rigorous training approach. I know a guy a friend of mine that does a lot of comics, and he draws all the stuff that we all look at, and one thing I was surprised by is we went to a life drawing class together. So we were drawing model from life, and he was really struggling. And he's a great comic artist. His inks are beautiful, his compositions are beautiful. He does figures really well. The superhero poses and models and the whole thing. But it was fascinating to see that he really struggled to draw from life. He had a hard time identifying the shapes of light and dark of the things that were right in front of his eyes. And I think that taught me a lot, is that, we can all get good at like sort of a schema. We can all come up with like a good methodology for like, oh, here's how I draw arms, here's how I draw hands, here's how I draw knuckles. You can get it down to all these fine little details. But let me double click here. But what I'm worried about with that is that we just kind of like, we create these little shorthands for how we do things, but our ability to see and record and respond to the world around us becomes maybe lost in some cases. There's some of us that just don't spend enough time developing that skill. And that's a skill that's super important. And that's a skill that we work on with this particular technique. And if you saw me starting out, look at this thing. You're like, okay, what's happening here? But if we take a step back, and let me go, you got a nice little undo button here at the top of the screen. We can just back it up, and you can see if I go far enough back, and you go all the way back to where it's just this bizarro selection. You're like, what was this guy doing? He's like doing this thing for ImagineFX, and this looks like complete garbage. What is that? And here's all it is. It's not perfectly proportioned. Her forehead's too big. You know, of course I see that there's problems with the proportion, and then, you know, there's stuff going on. But what I'm trying to do here is imagine I'm like a little ant or something. I'm like crawling along, tracing the contour of the shadow as it wraps and wraps and wraps and wraps and goes in and out around all of these different shapes. And I'm trying to see it as all one dark value. And I know there's tonal, there's different chroma or hue or whatever in like the lips versus the cheek versus, you know, back here by the ear or whatever. And there's different values too. But I'm just separating everything into light, dark, right? So I'm going to get that whole big dark shape. And you can see that that's kind of what I've got here. So if I walk it forward, you can see as I painted it in with that, there we go, like that dry brush, oil brush. And as it starts to fill, you have something that, okay, well, you know, while there's some proportional issues, it is starting to have some semblance of a face. So then you can go, okay, all right, well, let's trust the process a little bit. It looks a little funky, but we're going to keep going here. The idea is that we're going to stop trying to draw things and start drawing or painting light. And when we do that, then we can just grab, I'm just going to color sample from the reference, who cares? I'm just like, this is all for speed here. So let me press Control D to deselect. We can come in here and we can make really interesting things happen just by accurately or semi-accurately recording the shapes of the different values. There's this famous quote that, you know, I think all art students get pounded into their head in their first year, is that seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees. And what's going on there is this idea that to really understand what something is, we have to forget what we think we know about it, right? And what does that mean? Well, it's like this. You know, if your wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse, whatever, if you think you know them, you know, you've got their number, you got them pegged, you get who they are, you know what they're going to do, you know what they're going to say in every instance, and there's nothing ever new to discover about them. Well, the relationship's over, right? Like, what's the point? You're going to come home, the same exact thing is going to happen every single day, every time you see them, it's so on and so on. And there's no point, right? There's no point to like engaging. You already know everything. Well, of course, that's a terrible way to be in a relationship. That's a terrible way to get to know somebody, is just to assume that you know everything about them, right? Well, in art, it's quite similar. Well, like you can say that you have some gist of well, how things might work, or you have some idea, but when you sit down to paint, you sit down to draw, in my opinion, it's very important to sit down with fresh eyes and to absorb the subject as much as is humanly possible, just by deleting any preconceptions it might have, entering the subject fresh. As you step through the door into your studio, you sort of forget everything that you think you know about anything, and just be like a baby, like a sponge, sucking it all in. And it reminds me of the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He was the secretary for the very famous sculptor Augustin Rodin, right? Rodin, famous for the Kiss and a bunch of other amazing sculptures. He talks to his secretary, this young poet, and he's like, dude, he's reading his poems, and he's like, it's not, poems are okay, right? They're okay, but you got to learn to see. Why don't you go, you're trying to write about these big cats, these panthers, these whatever. Go to the zoo in Paris, just spend the whole day, just observing, and then come back. Then come back and we'll talk, right? Right after you learn to see. So it all starts with this observation, right? So this is one of those observation practices. Contour line drawing, another thing that, for my sake, I hate doing contour line drawing. It's just a practice that's so kind of like so tedious to me. This, similar to that, is a practice that can be very tedious. But what it is really good at, it's like good at getting you out of your head, out of what you think you know, and just start drawing and painting these values that you see. And what I'm doing here is being very kind of cavalier about it, right? I'm making mistakes. I'm going back over shapes. I'm having fun with it. I'm not being too worried about being perfect. And what I like about this is that as I create these sort of shapes, as I'm playing with this stuff, what I'm doing, I'm learning to see this subject, right? I'm capturing all these little details. And now, if I stick with the tool, that's that polygonal lasso tool, it's really good. Let me hold shift here and just add another selection. It's really good because everything is geometric and angular. Cool thing about that, it's insta unity, insta harmony. If your painting has all the same kind of shapes, all the same kind of edges, it's gonna have harmony, it's gonna have unity, it's gonna fit, it's gonna have that sense of like of consistency, right? Like that kind of like internal logic. And so even when I'm using the freehand tool, you get some of that benefit. So if you're an artist that's ever struggled with like, ooh, you know, that like I can do nice work, but it never really seems to have cohesion, this is one strategy you can use to get it, you know, is that you create a limitation for yourself and stick to that limitation. That limitation will create some sort of harmony because you will, you know, obviously have less choice. That less choice will narrow the field of operation. That will give you a sense of style and a sense of like consistency within the work. That said, this is like I say, it's more of like what I consider like a practice or training technique. It's not like my favorite way of working at all, but there are huge benefits to it. Anytime you can create that juxtaposition of the very like feathery textural mark with a really crisp edge, it creates a really unique overall feel. And sometimes you see fine artists do this. You do it with tape resists. Sometimes, you know, you get oil or acrylic painters doing taping a lot into their canvases and just kind of doing these, getting these really crisp edges. Sometimes you'll see people really need that really crisp edge on something like architecture or on like maybe you're drawing some tech, you know, like what you're trying to do is add like the helm and some character, but it, you know, everything's got to be really angular and edgy. Well, this could be a strategy you use. But while using the selection tool, painting can be great for just little pieces and parts of different paintings to really push something or make something feel really, you know, resolved or very architectural or very geometric, whatever. I like to also use this technique to train the brain to look for shapes. So as you can see here, I'm just basically drawing shapes that then become filled by my brush. And it's kind of a two-step process. So you go, you know, the first step is to look, find the shape, find the angle, look in here, see this, transition, cool, get this, pick the color, and make the brush whatever size you want, press Control D, and there you go. And I think it's a really fun way to work. It forces you to look at light, dark. It forces you to look at shapes of tones and just kind of record things in a simplified fashion. It's sort of like if you're familiar with painting or you know, illustration in Illustrator, how you work in Illustrator, real similar to that. How you just make shapes. Shapes have a fill color, they have a stroke color, and boom, you know, you're off. That's kind of what we're doing here. It's that we're forgetting the name of the thing one sees, in the sense that we're not trying to draw lips, we're not trying to draw eyes, we're not trying to draw a nose, we're just drawing light, we're just drawing shadow. And that is all we need to do for this technique to be successful. Using it with the kind of benefit of ArtRage's intrinsic textural approach to mark making, I think it's kind of cool. It's really unique, and it can be a good way to give an illustration project for a client something a little different. They're going to get just a different feel from you with this than they might with some other approaches. But more than that, like client-facing thing, I think it's just a good exercise for you to stop focusing on features. Too often people draw like they're drawing Mr. Potato Head. They're like, get my head shape, then I like stick an eye on there, stick a nose on there, stick a mouth on there, and it's very like it's an inorganic approach. For me, instead of looking at features, I like to look at value, and I like to look at light. I like to look at tone, and I think that helps me build the features into the face, or the shadows into the building, or the undulations into the hillside, or whatever, the shadows into the landscape. It helps me build that stuff more organically into the piece, instead of like I'm drawing trees or I'm drawing a forest. Instead, I'm saying I'm drawing highlights, I'm drawing shadows, I'm drawing midtones, I'm drawing reflected light, I'm drawing cool, I'm drawing warm. And that way I sort of forget the name of the thing I see, and instead of that, I start working on looking for relationships between these different tones, and how to create a composition that works for what I'm trying to accomplish. And that composition, that design of the light and dark, is more important than the details of an eye, nose, mouth, whatever. So anyway, yeah, you can always perfect your rendering. That's fine, that's good, that's important. But this approach, really fun, really good technique. And on my YouTube channel, I have a fully fleshed out finished painting using this technique. But for the sake of this tutorial, I just wanted to sort of introduce the concept, talk about it a little bit more, the theory behind it. And again, if you're into this kind of thing, check out my YouTube and find more. If you're interested in looking at my approaches to portraiture, you can see that with ArtRage or Photoshop. I have a class with ArtRage out now, and I have a class with Photoshop that will be out by the time of this publication, and that will be with Domestika. So there's a lot of cool things happening. Check out what's out there, and let me know how it goes for you. Thanks so much. Take care.